Habits are the invisible architecture of our daily lives.
We wake up, brush our teeth, check our phones, drink coffee, drive to work, and follow dozens of routines every day, many without thinking. In The Power of Habit, Charles Duhigg begins his journey into the science of habits by asking a simple question: why do we do what we do? In Chapter 1, titled The Habit Loop, How Habits Work, Duhigg introduces us to one of the most important discoveries in modern psychology: the idea that every habit follows a specific pattern, a three-step loop made up of a cue, a routine, and a reward. This simple framework explains not only how habits form but also how they can be changed. To show this in action, Duhigg tells the remarkable story of a man named Eugene Poley, or EP as researchers called him. Eugene had once been a successful engineer, a husband, and a father. But one day, a rare viral infection attacked his brain and destroyed a part of it called the medial temporal lobe, an area crucial for forming new memories. When he recovered, Eugene could remember everything from his life before the illness, his childhood, his family, his favorite foods, but he couldn't remember anything new for more than a minute or two. He couldn't tell you where his kitchen was, what he had for breakfast, or who his doctor was. His wife, Beverly, had to watch him constantly, afraid he'd get lost if he ever left the house alone. Then something fascinating happened. One morning, Eugene went for a walk. Beverly panicked. She hadn't seen him leave. She rushed outside to find him. But before she could, Eugene walked calmly back home, following the exact route he had taken. He did this again the next day, and the next. He didn't consciously remember the route, but somehow his brain had stored the pattern. Neuroscientists studying Eugene discovered that while the parts of his brain responsible for conscious memory were damaged, another region, the basal ganglia, was still perfectly intact. The basal ganglia is the part of the brain where habits live. It's responsible for storing patterns of behavior that, once learned, can operate automatically without conscious thought. Through studying Eugene, scientists realized something profound. Habits never really disappear, even when we lose our ability to remember them. They're etched deep in our neural circuitry, ready to spring into action when triggered by the right cue. From these findings, Duhigg and the researchers define the habit loop. First comes the cue, a signal that tells your brain to start the behavior. It could be a time of day, a place, an emotion, or a visual trigger. Next is the routine, the actual behavior or action you take. Finally, there's the reward, the satisfaction your brain receives from completing the loop. Over time, this loop becomes more and more automatic. The brain learns to associate the cue with the routine and the reward, creating a craving that drives the habit.
Duhigg gives a simple example. Imagine
you walk into the kitchen every afternoon, see a cookie jar, and eat a cookie. The cue is seeing the cookie jar, the routine is eating the cookie, and the reward is the burst of sweetness and comfort. After doing this a few times, your brain starts craving that sugar hit every afternoon. Soon you're not making a conscious choice, it's just a habit running on autopilot. This is why habits are so powerful. They free up our brains from making constant decisions, allowing us to focus on more complex tasks. Once a behavior becomes automatic, the brain essentially powers down. You no longer have to think about brushing your teeth or tying your shoes, you just do it. But this automatic nature is also what makes habits so hard to change, because the habit loop operates beneath conscious awareness. Even when we know a habit is bad, for us we often fall back into it without realizing. That's why simply deciding to break a habit rarely works. The old loop is still there, buried in the brain, waiting to be triggered again. Duhigg explains that the key to changing a habit lies in understanding and manipulating the loop. You can't erase a habit completely, but you can replace the routine while keeping the same cue and reward. For example, if your cue is stress and your reward is relaxation, instead of reaching for a cigarette, you might take a short walk or meditate. The cue and reward remain constant, but the routine shifts, creating a new, healthier habit. To drive this home, Duhigg describes how researchers tested these theories in laboratories with rats. In one famous experiment, scientists placed rats in a maze with a piece of chocolate at the end. At first, the rats wandered aimlessly. But as the experiment continued, their brains began to form a pattern. When the rats heard a click the cue, they automatically began following the same route, the routine to find the chocolate, the reward. As the rats learned, their brain activity actually decreased. Once the habit was formed, their brains stopped working so hard. This showed that habits don't just change behavior, they reprogram the brain to make actions effortless. The most fascinating part? Even when the maze was changed or the rats were given new obstacles, the original habit loop remained in their brains, dormant but ready to re-emerge if the same cue appeared. That's why for humans, two old habits never fully vanish. They can lie dormant for years, waiting for the right trigger to bring them back. Duhigg ends the chapter by emphasizing the enormous power of understanding this loop. Once you can identify the cue, the routine, and the reward behind a habit, you gain control. You can design new behaviors, break old ones, and even influence others from employees to consumers by shaping their habit loops.
This insight forms the foundation of everything that follows in the power of habit. Habits aren't destiny. They're patterns, and patterns can be understood, reshaped, and replaced. Whether it's an individual trying to stop smoking, a company seeking to improve customer loyalty, or a society wanting to promote better health, the process begins the same way, by recognizing the loop. So in essence, Chapter 1 gives us the blueprint for understanding all habits. Every behavior follows the same structure: cue, routine, reward. Our brains learn to crave the reward, the moment the cue appears, locking the loop in place. Once we understand that structure, we have the power to rewrite it. In Chapter 2 of The Power Habit, Charles Duhigg takes us deeper into the science of habits by exploring what really makes them stick, craving. While Chapter 1 introduced us to the habit loop, cue, routine, reward, this chapter reveals the hidden force that drives the loop: the anticipation of the reward, or in other words, the craving itself. Without craving, habits simply don't take root. The chapter begins with a story from the early 1900s, a time when brushing your teeth wasn't something most Americans did. Believe it or not, at the start of the 20th century, very few people brushed daily, and tooth decay was a national problem. Then came a man named Claude Hopkins, one of the greatest advertising minds in history, who was hired to sell a new toothpaste called Pepsodent. Hopkins had already made his name promoting products like Quaker Oats and Palmolive soap, but toothpaste was different. It wasn't something people felt they needed. So he looked for a way to create a desire, a craving for it. Hopkins' genius came from understanding human psychology even before the science of habit formation was well studied. He realized that to make people adopt a new behavior, he needed to give them a clear cue and a satisfying reward. His advertisements told readers to run their tongues over their teeth. "You'll feel a film," the ad said. "That's what makes your teeth look dull." Then it promised that brushing with Pepsodent would remove that film and give you a beautiful smile. In reality, that film was a natural coating everyone has on their teeth. But the marketing worked. Millions of people suddenly became aware of it and uncomfortable with it. The cue became the feeling of the film, and the reward was the clean, tingly sensation after brushing. Within a decade, Pepsodent turned brushing into a daily ritual. Toothpaste sales exploded, and within 20 years, toothbrushing had become a national habit. The key wasn't just the product. It was the craving for that fresh, tingling feeling that followed. Years later, scientists discovered the neurological explanation behind Hopkins' success. When people are exposed to a cue, their brains begin anticipating a reward. If the brain starts craving that reward, the loop becomes nearly impossible to resist. Researchers at MIT and other institutions conducted studies showing that as habits form the brain, activity associated with craving spikes right before the behavior begins. The brain isn't just responding to the reward, it's anticipating it. The cue triggers a powerful expectation, and when the reward is delivered, the brain reinforces the loop. To illustrate how powerful this craving mechanism can be, Duhigg shares the story of Febreze, a product developed by Procter & Gamble in the 1990s. Febreze was designed to remove odors from fabrics and furniture. In early tests, it worked perfectly. It could eliminate the smell of cigarettes, pets, or sweat from clothing. Yet, despite its effectiveness, it initially failed in the market. People simply weren't using it. The P&G marketing team was puzzled. They visited the homes of test users and noticed something strange. People who needed Febreze, the most pet owners, smokers, homemakers, surrounded by strong odors, didn't realize how bad their homes smelled. They had grown so used to the odors that they didn't notice them anymore. There was no cue to prompt them to use the product. So the marketers went back to the drawing board and reimagined Febrez's purpose. Instead of advertising it as an odor remover, they started promoting it as a finishing touch to cleaning. They added a light, pleasant scent to the formula and designed commercials, showing people happily spraying Febreze after making the bed or tidying the room. Now the cue became finishing, a cleaning task, and the reward was the fresh, clean smell that completed the routine. That subtle shift changed everything. Suddenly, people began craving that final spray of freshness, that little moment that made their cleaning feel complete. Febreze sales skyrocketed, turning it into one of Procter and Gamble's biggest successes. This story reinforces Duhigg's central point. Craving drives the habit loop. The cue triggers an anticipation, and the reward satisfies it, but it's the craving in between that keeps the loop spinning. Without a craving, there's no motivation to repeat the behavior. Duhigg explains that this principle applies to countless everyday habits. The craving for the endorphin rush makes runners lace up their shoes each morning. The craving for connection drives us to check our phones and social media notifications. The craving for relaxation makes smokers reach for a cigarette. Once a brain associates a cue with a satisfying reward, it begins to crave that sensation automatically. Neuroscientists even tested this phenomenon by studying monkeys that were trained to pull a lever when a light appeared in exchange for a drop of juice. Over time, as soon as the light turned on, the cue, the monkeys' brains released dopamine, the chemical linked to pleasure and anticipation. What's fascinating is that the dopamine spike occurred before the reward was given, not after. The monkeys weren't responding to the juice, they were responding to the expectation of the juice. And when researchers stopped giving the reward, the monkeys became agitated and frustrated, evidence that the craving had taken hold. Their brains had wired the cue and the routine together so tightly that, without the reward, the habit loop felt incomplete. This craving mechanism is why habits can feel so irresistible even when we consciously know better. It's not the routine itself, smoking, scrolling, snacking, that's so powerful. It's the craving for what comes after relief, pleasure, satisfaction. Our brains are constantly searching for cues that signal rewards. And once we find them, the loop becomes automatic. Duhigg closes the chapter by showing that understanding this process gives us an incredible advantage. To create a new habit, you don't have to overhaul your entire behavior. You simply need to identify a cue, define the routine, and most importantly, create a craving for the reward. When people start to want the feeling that comes after a habit, not just perform the action mechanically, the habit becomes part of their identity. That's why people who crave the post-run energy end up becoming runners. Or why coffee. Drinkers don't just crave caffeine, they crave the warmth, the ritual, and the comfort that comes with it. In short, Chapter 2 reveals the emotional core of the habit loop. Habits don't form because we're disciplined, they form because our brains learn to crave the sensations they produce. Once a craving is born, the habit becomes automatic. So if you want to build a new habit or break an old one, start by asking, what is the craving driving this loop? When you understand that you can shape your habits instead of letting them shape you. In Chapter 3 of The Power of Habit, Charles Duhigg takes the science of habits one step further and reveals the secret to changing them. He calls it the golden rule of habit change, and it's surprisingly simple. You can't extinguish a bad habit, you can only change it. This chapter explores how deep-rooted behaviors can be transformed by keeping the same cue and reward, but swapping out the routine in between. Duhigg shows how this rule has changed lives, rebuilt organizations, and even reshaped entire industries. He begins with the story of Tony Dungy, one of the most respected coaches in American football. When Dungy took over the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in the 1990s, the team was struggling, badly disorganized, inconsistent, and constantly losing. Dungy's approach to turning The team around wasn't about inventing new plays or building bigger players. It was about habits. Duhigg believed that football players make too many decisions in the heat of a game. The speed of the sport doesn't allow time to think. His idea was simple but revolutionary. If his players could reprogram their habits, their automatic reactions, they could play faster and smarter than anyone else. Instead of teaching complex strategies, he trained his team to focus on cues and automatic responses. For example, rather than analyzing every move of the offense, players learned to recognize just one cue, the way an opponent's foot was planted or the tilt of their shoulders, and respond instantly with a rehearsed action. Duhigg drilled these patterns over and over until they became instinctive. The result was remarkable. The Buccaneers, once one of the worst teams in the league, began improving rapidly. They weren't thinking, they were reacting automatically. Their brains had learned to follow new habit loops under pressure. But the transformation wasn't complete, not yet. Duhigg explains that during close games, when stress levels were high, players often reverted to their old habits. They'd lose focus, make mistakes, and fall back into familiar patterns. It wasn't enough to train the brain, they needed something more, something that would keep the new habits alive when it mattered most. That something, Duhigg says, was belief. And belief, it turns out, is a crucial ingredient in changing habits. Without belief, habits crumble under stress. With belief, they stick. To illustrate this, Duhigg shifts from football to another world entirely, the story of alcoholics. Anonymous or AA. For decades, AA has helped millions of people overcome addiction, and its methods align perfectly with the golden rule of habit change. AA doesn't ask members to erase their craving for alcohol, because that craving never fully disappears. Instead, it helps them replace the routine of drinking with a new one, attending meetings, sharing stories, and building community. The cue, feelings of stress, loneliness, or anxiety, and the reward, a sense of relief or connection, stay the same. Only the routine changes. When recovering alcoholics feel the familiar cues that once led them to drink, they now go to meetings or call a sponsor instead. They find comfort and understanding in that new behavior, which fulfills the same emotional need. But again, the real magic is belief. Many recovering addicts say that the turning point came when they began to believe that change was possible, that they had support, and that a higher power or community would help them through it. It's that belief that keeps the new habit loop strong when life becomes difficult. Duhigg points out that belief doesn't have to be religious, though it often is in AA. What matters is the sense that change is possible, that you're not alone. Studies have shown that people who belong to strong groups, whether in sports, religion, or recovery programs, are far more likely to maintain new habits because belief becomes a shared experience. Duhigg connects this back to Tony Dungy's football team. When Dungy's son tragically passed away, his players rallied around him and one another. The grief they shared deepened their belief in Dungy's philosophy and in each other. That season, everything clicked. They began to trust the system and themselves. The Buccaneers transformed into one of the strongest teams in the NFL, and a few years later, when Duhigg moved to the Indianapolis Colts, he used the same method to lead his new team to a Super Bowl victory. The lesson is, clear habits can't just be replaced by willpower alone. You have to believe in the change. You have to have faith in yourself, in a system, or in a community that supports your growth. That belief is what turns fragile new routines into lasting transformations. Duhigg also explains that this same principle applies far beyond football. Fields and recovery groups, companies, organizations, and even societies can change habits if they understand this rule. He shares examples of businesses that have restructured employee habits, not by issuing orders, but by changing the cues and rewards that drive behavior. For instance, in customer service, industries managers who recognize the cues that trigger frustration and reward employees for positive responses can reshape company culture. In hospitals, safety protocols that reward transparency instead of punishment help build habits of honesty and care. The golden rule of habit change, Duhigg says, works because it doesn't fight against human nature. It works with it. The cue and the reward are what our brains crave. By swapping out the routine, we redirect that craving toward something positive. Imagine, for example, someone who smokes whenever they feel stressed. The cue is stress and the reward is relief. Instead of trying to eliminate the craving, for relief, the person could learn to take a walk or practice deep breathing when that cue appears. Over time, the brain learns that the new routine offers the same reward, the same feeling of calm. Without the cigarette, the craving remains, but the routine changes. That's the essence of transformation. By the end of chapter 3, Duhigg leaves us with a powerful insight. Habit change isn't about erasing old patterns. It's about rewriting them. Habits are resilient because they live deep in our brains, but they're also flexible when we approach them with understanding. If we can identify the cue, recognize the reward, and believe in a new routine, we can reshape almost any habit, personal, professional, or social. This chapter reminds us that change is not only possible, it's predictable. It doesn't require superhuman strength or endless willpower. It requires awareness, consistency, and belief. So when you find yourself stuck in an old pattern, whether it's procrastination, overeating, or negative thinking, remember the golden rule. Keep the cue, keep the reward, but change the routine. And most importantly, believe that you can. Because as Duhigg shows, belief isn't just part of the process. It's the habit that makes all other habits possible. In chapter 4 of The Power of Habit, Charles Duhigg introduces a fascinating idea that some habits matter more than others. These special routines, called keystone habits, have the power to spark widespread transformation. Changing one keystone habit can start a chain reaction that reshapes other behaviors, attitudes, and results in ways we might never expect. To explain this concept, Duhigg begins with the story of Paul O'Neill, who became the CEO of the aluminum company Alcoa in 1987. When O'Neill gave his first speech to investors and industry analysts, they expected him to talk about profits, costs, and growth strategies. Instead, he stood on stage and said something completely unexpected. "I want to talk to you about worker safety." The audience was stunned. Safety? Investors thought he was crazy. But O'Neill wasn't joking. He told everyone that his top priority was to make Alcoa the safest company in America. He said his goal was simple: 0 workplace injuries. He believed that by focusing on safety, everything else in the company would improve as well. At first, the business community was skeptical. But within a few years, O'Neill's focus on safety completely transformed Alcoa. Accidents dropped dramatically. Productivity soared. Employee morale skyrocketed. And profits hit record highs. So what happened? How could focusing on safety, something that seemed unrelated to profit, lead to such incredible success? Duhigg explains that safety was a keystone habit. By changing one key pattern, O'Neill triggered a ripple effect across the entire organization. To improve safety, workers and managers had to communicate better. Problems had to be reported immediately. Processes had to be redesigned. That created a culture of openness, accountability, and problem-solving. Employees began to feel valued and heard. As a result, they started caring more about their work, and that improved performance everywhere. Keystone habits, Duhigg says, are powerful because they create small wins. These small victories build momentum, motivation, and confidence. They make people feel capable of change, which in turn leads to more change. When people experience success, even a tiny one, they start to believe that bigger transformations are possible. This principle doesn't just apply to companies. It applies to individuals too. For example, exercise is a keystone habit for many people. When someone starts exercising regularly, they often begin eating healthier, sleeping better, and becoming more productive at work. They might start spending less, smoking less, or even being more patient with loved ones. The simple act of exercising triggers a wave of other positive habits, not because exercise causes them directly, but because it changes the way we see ourselves. When we adopt a keystone habit, we begin to see evidence that we are capable of self-control, discipline, and growth. That belief spills into other areas of life. Duhigg shares the story of a woman named Lassa Allen who had been smoking, overweight, and deeply unhappy. One day, after a painful breakup, she decided to travel to Egypt. Standing before the pyramids, she made a promise to herself she would quit smoking. That was it, one single change. But as months passed, that one change rippled outward. She started running to distract herself from cravings. Running led to healthier eating. Healthier eating led to better sleep. Better sleep led to more focus at work. A few years later, she had lost weight, was in a stable career, and described herself as a completely different person. The key here is that she didn't try to overhaul her entire life at once. She changed one keystone habit, and that one change triggered a chain reaction. Duhigg explains that scientists and psychologists have long observed this pattern. Keystone habits create small wins that compound. Small wins are critical because they shift our mindset from defeat to progress. When we feel a sense of achievement, even a small one, our brains release dopamine, a chemical that motivates us to keep going. Over time, this momentum reshapes our identity. He gives another example from the world of family life: eating dinner together. Studies show that families who make a habit of sitting down for dinner even just a few times a week tend to have children who get better grades, are more emotionally stable, and are less likely to engage in risky behavior. The dinner itself isn't magical, it's the keystone habit that creates opportunities for communication, structure, and connection. Keystone habits, Duhigg says, often appear to be small or even trivial, but they have disproportionate power because they change how we see ourselves and how we operate within systems. They set off a domino effect of positive change. Returning to the story of Paul O'Neill and Alcoa, Duhigg highlights how focusing on one keystone habit not only improved safety and profits, but also transformed the company's entire culture. O'Neill's approach empowered employees to report issues without fear, and that transparency built trust. Managers started to share ideas across departments. When problems arose, they were solved collaboratively. By focusing on safety, O'Neill unknowingly built a system of excellence. Years later, when O'Neill retired, Alcoa's profits were 5 times higher than when he started, and the company had one of the best safety records in the world. Investors who had once thought O'Neill was crazy ended up calling him a genius. Duhigg's message in this chapter is clear: not all habits are equal. Some have the power to unlock a chain of transformation. If you want to change your life, your business, or your community, start by identifying and changing your keystone habits. He explains that finding a keystone habit often involves asking, what's one behavior that if changed could make everything else easier? It might be exercising, keeping a journal, having family dinners, making your bed, or committing to a daily reflection routine. These habits create structure, build confidence, and ripple outward. Duhigg closes the chapter with a powerful insight that transformation doesn't happen all at once. It starts with small, consistent actions that shift our patterns and beliefs. Change isn't a sudden event. It's a process that begins with one key habit and grows outward through momentum and confidence. So whether you're trying to build a better organization or a better version of yourself, focus on your keystone habits. Don't try to change everything at once. Find that one habit that has the power to spark others and start there. Because as Duhigg shows, when you get the right habit to fall, the rest begin to follow. In Chapter 5 of The Power of Habit, Charles Duhigg explores one of the most powerful and misunderstood habits of all: willpower. We often think of willpower as something you either have or you don't, a trait that some lucky people are born with. But Duhigg shows that willpower is actually a habit, one that can be trained, strengthened, and made automatic just like any other behavior. He begins with the story of a young woman named Travis Leach, whose life seemed destined for failure. Travis grew up in a troubled household, dropped out of high school, and bounced from one dead-end job to another. He was angry, anxious, and lacked self-control. But years later, he became a successful manager at Starbucks, admired by his team and respected by his customers. So what changed? Travis credits Starbucks for teaching him one skill he had never mastered before: self-discipline. Starbucks, Duhigg explains, discovered that the key to great customer service wasn't just hiring friendly people, it was teaching willpower. The company learned that baristas who could stay calm and positive under stress made the biggest difference in customer satisfaction. So they began training employees not just in making coffee, but in how to manage their emotions, build habits of self-control, and respond gracefully in difficult situations. Duhigg shares that Starbucks created detailed manuals and workshops designed to prepare employees for the toughest moments on the job, like dealing with an angry customer or handling a long line during the morning rush. Instead of simply telling employees to stay calm, Starbucks gave them routines to follow when those emotional cues appeared. For example, when a customer was rude, baristas were trained to use a system called the latte method. Listen to the customer, acknowledge their problem, take action to solve it, thank them, and explain why the issue occurred. By practicing these steps repeatedly, employees didn't have to rely on spontaneous self-control. The behavior became automatic, a habit. The cue was frustration. The routine was the latte response, and the reward was a sense of pride and calm after handling the situation well. This approach turned willpower into a predictable, repeatable habit, not a fleeting emotion. Duhigg connects this to research in psychology that has shown willpower behaves much like a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it becomes. But if you overuse it, it can also get tired. This concept, known as ego depletion, explains why we sometimes have the strength to resist temptation in the morning, but give in to cravings by the end of the day. One famous experiment illustrating this idea is the marshmallow test. In the 1960s, researchers offered young children a choice. They could eat one marshmallow immediately or wait a few minutes and get two. Some kids gave in right away, while others distracted themselves and managed to wait. Years later, scientists followed up with those children and discovered something remarkable. The ones who had shown self-control at age 4 tended to have higher grades, better relationships, and more success as adults. This showed that willpower, the ability to delay gratification, is one of the strongest predictors of success. But the key insight is that willpower can be taught. Duhigg highlights that when people are given specific plans for how to handle challenges, their self-control improves dramatically. It's not enough to say, "I'll try harder." You need a routine, a clear plan that tells your brain what to do when the cue for temptation or stress appears. In another study, researchers asked a group of people trying to build an exercise habit to write down specific plans for when and where they would work out and how they would handle obstacles. Those who made these if-then plans, such as, "If I feel tired after work, I'll just change into my workout clothes and walk for 5 minutes," were far more successful. The plan gave them a script, a routine, to follow automatically instead of relying on raw willpower in the moment. Starbucks applied this same principle with Travis and thousands of other employees. For someone like Travis, who had grown up surrounded by chaos, Starbucks became a school for discipline. It wasn't about forcing self-control, it was about creating systems that made the right choices easier. Over time, he learned to approach stressful situations with confidence instead of panic. His job gave him structure habits and a sense of mastery. Duhigg also discusses how willpower can be contagious within groups. Teams that have shared routines for managing pressure tend to stay calmer and more focused. Whether it's a company, a classroom, or a family, when a group practices disciplined habits together, that collective willpower becomes part of the culture. In fact, companies like Starbucks realized that teaching willpower didn't just improve customer service, it improved lives. Employees who learned to manage stress at work often reported being better at handling challenges. At home, quitting bad habits and setting long-term goals. Like a muscle, their self-control grew stronger with use. Duhigg also shares a striking example from the US military, where recruits are trained not just for combat skills, but also for emotional habits, how to stay calm under pressure, how to follow routines automatically in moments of chaos. The goal is the same, to make self-control instinctive. The key takeaway from all these stories is that willpower is not a personality trait, it's a learned habit. It starts with recognizing the cues that test your discipline, having a practiced routine for responding, and reinforcing the reward that follows good choices. For instance, if you want to build the habit of saving money, the cue might be payday. The routine is automatically transferring money into savings, and the reward is the satisfaction of watching your balance grow. If you want to resist junk food, the cue might be stress. The routine is drinking water or taking a walk, and the reward is feeling lighter, and in control. Duhigg explains that when people design habits that support their goals, they don't have to rely on constant willpower because the right behavior becomes automatic. That's why the most successful people and organizations don't depend on heroic bursts of discipline. They build systems that make discipline effortless. As the chapter concludes, Duhigg reminds us that willpower is like a reservoir. It needs to be protected and replenished. Rest planning and structure help preserve it. The more you design your environment to reduce temptation and stress, the more energy you'll have for what truly matters. In the end, the lesson of Chapter 5 is deeply empowering. Willpower isn't something you're born with. It's something you build. Through planning, practice, and the right habits, self-control can become second nature. Just like the baristas at Starbucks, anyone can learn to stay calm under pressure, resist distractions, and turn discipline into a daily routine. Because when willpower becomes a habit, success follows naturally. In Chapter 6 of The Power of Habit, Charles Duhigg explores how crises can become powerful opportunities for change, especially when it comes to reshaping habits inside organizations. The main idea is that leaders can use moments of tension or disaster to introduce new routines, systems, and values that might otherwise face resistance. It's in chaos that people become open to transformation. The chapter opens with a story from a tragic incident at Rhode Island Hospital. In one of the state's most prestigious medical institutions, a series of shocking medical errors occurred. Surgeons operated on the wrong side of patients' heads, ignored nurses' warnings, and made mistakes that led to unnecessary suffering, even death. How could such a respected hospital allow this to happen? The problem, Duhigg explains, was not incompetence, it was habit. Over time, the hospital had developed deeply ingrained patterns of behavior. Surgeons acted like unquestioned authorities, nurses stayed silent out of fear, and communication broke down. The culture encouraged obedience over collaboration. These were habits invisible, automatic, and powerful. When tragedy struck, the public outcry forced the hospital to face the truth. Under pressure, the leadership used the crisis as a turning point. They began changing routines, empowering nurses to speak up, creating checklists, and establishing open lines of communication. It was slow and painful, but over time, these new habits began to reshape the culture. Duhigg points out that this pattern is not unique to hospitals. Organizations of all kinds, from corporations to governments, are guided by collective habits. They shape how decisions are made, how people communicate, and how problems are solved. But these habits are often invisible until a crisis exposes them. That's why crises, while painful, are also moments of possibility. When routines break down, people are finally willing to reconsider how things are done. Leaders who understand this can use crises to redesign the habits of their teams and institutions. To illustrate this point further, Duhigg tells the story of Paul O'Neill, again the same leader we met earlier in Chapter 4, who transformed Alcoa by focusing on safety. But here we see a deeper layer of his leadership, how he used potential crises to reinforce new habits. For example, when an accident occurred at one of Alcoa's plants, O'Neill required managers to report it within 24 hours and explain what steps were being taken to prevent it from happening again. This routine forced communication and transparency across every level of the company. It created a new habit loop. The cue was an accident. The routine was open, reporting and collaboration, and the reward was recognition for honesty and improvement. At first, managers were terrified. In the old Alcoa culture, reporting a problem could get you punished. But Neil made sure that the opposite happened. He praised openness and punished silence. Over time, this rewired the entire organization. What began as a crisis management routine became a core cultural habit. Duhigg calls this process keystone, change through crisis. When leaders harness a crisis correctly, they can rebuild their organization around stronger, healthier habits. But if they ignore it, the same crisis can destroy them. He also provides an example from the London Underground, the city's subway system, which faced a deadly fire in 1987 at King's Cross Station. The disaster killed 31 people and shocked the nation. When investigators looked deeper, they found that the tragedy wasn't caused by a single mistake. It was the product of bad habits within the organization. For years, departments had operated in silos. Fire safety was handled separately from maintenance, which was separate from management. Employees followed routines that prioritized efficiency and hierarchy over safety. When smoke was first seen on the night of the fire, workers followed the rules but not common sense. No one was authorized to make decisions outside their department's responsibilities. The system's habits paralyzed everyone. After the tragedy, a new chairman, Sir Robert Reed, used the crisis as a catalyst for change. He overhauled communication. Procedures broke down departmental barriers and trained employees to act quickly and collaboratively in emergencies. These new habits didn't just improve safety, they transformed the entire culture of the underground. Duhigg emphasizes that the most effective leaders don't wait for crises to pass, they seize them. They understand that people are most willing to change their habits when they feel unsettled, when the old ways clearly aren't working. A crisis creates the emotional energy and urgency that habit change requires. But leadership is not just about reacting to accidents, it's also about creating moments of constructive crisis. Skilled leaders sometimes simulate urgency to motivate change before disaster strikes. They use symbolic gestures, bold goals, or public commitments to jolt people out of complacency. For instance, O'Neill didn't wait for Alcoa to fail. He created his own kind of crisis by declaring that worker safety was more important than profits, a radical idea that unsettled everyone at first. That tension forced people to rethink their routines. It was a designed crisis, one that led to renewal instead of ruin. Duhigg connects this insight to psychology, explaining that people rarely change habits through logic alone. Emotions drive behavior. A crisis, real or symbolic, taps into those emotions, fear, uncertainty, urgency, and opens the door to new habits. But once the door is open, leaders must act quickly to replace old routines with new, better ones before people revert to their comfort zones. He writes that crises are such valuable opportunities that wise leaders often try to manufacture them. This might sound manipulative, but it's often the only way to break through inertia without emotional disruption. Most people and most organizations simply drift back to what feels familiar. In the end, Duhigg brings the lesson full circle. Organizations, like people, are collections of habits. Some are healthy, others destructive. Leaders who understand how habits work, who know how to identify cues, routines, and rewards, can reshape those patterns and, in doing so, reshape entire cultures. The challenge is timing and courage. Crises can destroy, but they can also create. The difference lies in how leaders respond. Those who use crises to introduce better habits build stronger organizations. Those who ignore them or fail to act simply rebuild the same fragile systems that will eventually fail again. The story of Rhode Island Hospital ends with hope. After facing lawsuits, public anger, and heartbreaking loss, the institution reinvented itself. Nurses were encouraged to speak up, teamwork replaced. Hierarchy and safety became a shared value. Over time, these new habits became ingrained. Mistakes dropped dramatically. The hospital didn't just recover, it became one of the safest in the nation. Duhigg's message is clear, and powerful habits determine the destiny of every organization, but crises are the moments that give us the chance to rewrite them. When things fall apart, we have a rare opportunity to look at the routines we've taken for granted, to question what's automatic, and to rebuild from the ground up. Whether it's a company, a community, or even a personal life, a crisis can be the moment that changes everything, if we have the courage to use it well. In Chapter 7 of The Power of Habit, Charles Duhigg takes us deep into the world of marketing data and human behavior, showing how companies use the science of habits to predict and even shape what we buy. This chapter reads almost like a detective story, revealing how corporations have learned to peek into our private routines and subtly guide our choices, all through understanding the power of habit loops. The chapter begins with a fascinating and slightly unsettling story from Target, one of America's biggest retail chains. A few years ago, Target's marketing department hired a group of statisticians and psychologists to study shopping data. Their goal was to figure out what customers were likely to buy. not just in general, but specifically so that they could send people personalized coupons and offers. They soon discovered that pregnancy was a particularly powerful period of consumer change. Expecting parents, especially new mothers, were entering a stage of life where old habits were disrupted and new ones were being formed. This made them the perfect target, literally, for marketers. If Target could identify women who were pregnant before anyone else, they could build brand loyalty early. The challenge was that pregnancy is deeply personal. You can't exactly ask someone if they're expecting, so Target decided to use data to find out. A statistician named Andrew Pohl analyzed the purchasing patterns of women who had registered for baby showers. He found subtle but consistent clues. For instance, women in their second trimester often bought unscented lotion, vitamins like calcium and zinc, and larger quantities of cotton balls. By tracking these habits, Pohl developed a pregnancy prediction model. The model worked astonishingly well. Based on changes in shopping behavior, Target could estimate not only whether a customer was pregnant, but even her due date. Within a couple of weeks, Duhigg shares a now famous story. A man walked into a Target store near Minneapolis furious because his teenage daughter had received mailers for maternity clothes, nursery furniture, and baby formula. "Are you trying to encourage her to get pregnant?" he yelled at the manager. The store apologized profusely, but a few days later, the father called back, embarrassed. It turned out that his daughter was pregnant, and she hadn't told him yet. This story spread quickly, sparking a national debate about privacy and corporate surveillance. But behind the shock was a deeper insight. Our habits reveal who we are, and sometimes even who we're becoming before we consciously realize it ourselves. Duhigg explains that modern companies use this data not only to predict habits, but to influence them. Target, for example, learned an important lesson after that incident. When they sent women direct pregnancy-related ads, many found it invasive. So Target began disguising its marketing. Instead of sending a brochure filled with baby products, they mixed in ads for unrelated items like lawn, mowers, or wine glasses. That way, the recipient wouldn't realize she was being singled out, but her subconscious habits would still be triggered. This strategy worked. Sales of baby products rose dramatically. Target had learned to shape habits without customers noticing. Duhigg then zooms out to explore how this concept applies across industries. Every major retailer, from grocery stores to tech companies, collects mountains of behavioral data. They track what we buy when we buy it, how often we click, scroll, and pause. By identifying our cues and rewards, the structure of our habit loops, they can predict what we'll do next and nudge us toward specific behaviors. For instance, think about the layout of a supermarket. Fresh produce and baked goods are placed at the front, not by accident, but by design. The smell of fresh bread and the sight of colorful fruits put us in a buying mood. That's the cue. Then, as we walk through the aisles, we encounter endless rewards, discount samples, and the satisfaction of discovery. These elements reinforce shopping habits that keep us coming back. Duhigg emphasizes that habits are incredibly powerful, precisely because they're automatic. When companies tap into them, they can shape our decisions in ways that feel natural, even inevitable. But this power also raises ethical questions. Where is the line between serving customers and manipulating them? He explores how companies learned to use habit substitution, replacing old cues and rewards with new ones to sell products. For example, toothpaste. Manufacturers in the early 1900s faced a huge problem. Most Americans didn't brush their teeth. Then a marketing genius named Claude Hopkins changed everything by adding mint flavor and advertising the tingling clean feeling. That tingle had no real purpose, but it created a powerful reward sensation. Within a decade, daily brushing had become a national habit. The same strategy appears everywhere today. From morning coffee to evening, Netflix binges companies design cues and rewards to keep us hooked. Duhigg calls it the habit marketing loop. Once a company understands your routine, when you wake up, what you eat, what stresses you, they can predict what will tempt you next. But Duhigg doesn't just paint a picture of manipulation. He also shows how awareness gives us back control. Once we understand how our habits are formed, the cues, the routines, and the rewards, we can choose which ones to keep and which to change. The same science that companies use to influence us can also empower us to reshape our own behavior. He gives the example of how Target eventually realized that their marketing could be too predictive. They decided to make it less about spying and more about timing. Instead of exposing secrets, they began focusing on helpful triggers like sending discounts for baby products around the time new parents were already shopping for them. When used responsibly, habit prediction can actually make customers' lives easier rather than intrusive. By the end of the chapter, Duhigg invites us to look at our own lives through this lens. Every day we follow patterns: when we wake, what we eat, where we shop, how we unwind. Most of these routines feel like choices, but many are habits carefully shaped by cues and rewards around us. The more we become aware of them, the more power we have to change them. He reminds us that companies will always try to sell to our habits. That's business. But it's up to us to decide whether we're being nudged or being controlled. Awareness is the first step toward freedom. Ultimately, Chapter 7 isn't just about marketing. It's about self-awareness in a world designed to influence us. The science of habits has given corporations extraordinary insight into human behavior. Yet the same knowledge gives individuals extraordinary power to take back control. So the next time you get a coupon that seems oddly perfect, or you find yourself reaching for the same brand, without thinking, pause for a moment. Ask yourself, what cue triggered this routine? What reward am I seeking? And most importantly, who designed this habit, me or someone else? Because as Duhigg shows, in the age of data and persuasion, understanding our habits isn't just a matter of self-improvement. It's a matter of independence. In Chapter 8 of The Power of Habit, Charles Duhigg explores how social habits shape communities, organizations, and even entire movements. While earlier chapters focused on individual and corporate habits, this one zooms out to a much larger scale, revealing how revolutions, social change, and collective action are driven by the same forces that shape our personal lives. The chapter begins with a moment that changed history. Montgomery, Alabama, December 1st, 1955. On that day, a quiet seamstress named Rosa Parks boarded a city bus after work and sat in the colored section just behind the seats reserved for white passengers. When the bus filled up, the driver ordered Parks and 3 other black passengers to move. The others obeyed. Rosa Parks did not. Her arrest became the spark that ignited the Montgomery bus boycott, one of the defining moments of the American civil rights movement. But Duhigg points out something important. Rosa Parks was not the first person arrested for refusing to give up her seat. Others before her had done the same. So why did her act of defiance lead to a movement that changed history? The answer, Duhigg explains, lies in social habits, the invisible patterns that bind communities together. Rosa Parks was deeply embedded in Montgomery's social network. She wasn't a radical or an outsider. She was known and respected. She volunteered at her church, worked with local youth groups, and had friends across both social and economic lines. When she was arrested, her wider circle of acquaintances, teachers, ministers, shopkeepers, and civic leaders, immediately felt personally connected to her story. In other words, her act didn't spread through strangers. It spread through friends and strong social ties. People who knew Parks didn't just see an injustice. They saw something happening to someone they cared about. But Duhigg explains that friendships alone don't sustain a movement. What began with close personal ties needed to expand, and that's where weak ties came in. Weak ties are looser connections, acquaintances, co-workers, or people we recognize but don't know well. These relationships act as bridges between different social groups, allowing information and energy to spread far beyond one community. In Montgomery, these weak ties helped the boycott grow. As word spread through churches and social clubs, even people who didn't know, Rosa Parks personally felt pressure to participate. Social expectations, what psychologists call peer pressure, took hold. People joined not just because they believed in the cause, but because their community expected it. And soon, what began as one woman's decision turned into a citywide protest. Duhigg shows that every social movement follows this same pattern, a kind of three-step habit loop of collective change. It begins with the habits of friendship, then spreads through the habits of the community, and finally endures through the habits of leadership and shared belief. To illustrate this, Duhigg turns to another modern example, Saddleback Church, a megachurch in California founded by Pastor Rick Warren. When Warren started Saddleback in the early 1980s, he had no building, no congregation, and very little money. Yet within a few decades, Saddleback became one of the largest churches in America with tens of thousands of regular attendees. Warren's success wasn't based on flashy marketing or strict doctrine. It was built on understanding how habits form within communities. He discovered that people are drawn to groups not just because of beliefs, but because of relationships. When newcomers arrived, Saddleback leaders made sure to connect them into small groups, tight circles of friends who met regularly in homes, prayed together, and supported one another. These small groups became social habit loops. The cue was the weekly meeting. The routine was conversation and shared support, and the reward was belonging. Over time, those small groups created powerful bonds of trust and accountability. People began attending services regularly, volunteering, and inviting friends. Faith became a habit not just of prayer, but of participation. Warren often said, "People come to Saddleback for the sermons, but they stay for the friendships." Just like Rosa Parks' social circle sparked a movement, Saddleback's small groups created networks that transformed faith into a daily routine. Duhigg's message is that movements grow because of social habits shared, routines that connect individuals into a collective identity. Whether it's a boycott, a church, or a political campaign, the pattern is the same. People act when they feel personally connected, and they keep acting when those behaviors become socially expected and emotionally rewarding. The final piece of the puzzle Duhigg explains is leadership and belief. In Montgomery, after the initial surge of solidarity, the movement might have faded except that it gained a new leader. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. King gave the boycott direction, discipline, and a moral framework. He turned collective anger into purpose. Through his sermons, speeches, and example, King helped participants see themselves as part of something larger than protest, as part of a moral awakening. This belief sustained them through hardship, threats, and violence. King didn't just demand action, he reinforced a new habit, nonviolent resistance rooted in faith and dignity. Every march, every meeting, every prayer was a repetition of that routine, and through repetition it became habit. Duhigg argues that this combination, strong social ties, expanding weak ties, and a unifying belief system, is what allows small movements to grow into powerful forces for change. He also points out that this same structure appears across history, from labor unions to women's rights, from Alcoholics Anonymous to modern social networks. Movements spread when personal relationships, community, norms, and shared identities align. The cues are emotional injustice, hope, belonging, and the rewards are deep, meaning, purpose, and connection. But Duhigg also offers a warning. Social habits can be used for both good and ill. The same dynamics that fueled the civil rights movement can also sustain extremism or oppression. Once a group's routines and beliefs solidify into habit, they can resist change. For better or worse, the true power, he says, lies in understanding how these habits work and choosing to shape them consciously rather than letting them control us. As the chapter closes, Duhigg returns to Rosa Parks' story. What made her act of defiance so transformative wasn't luck or timing. It was the web of habits and relationships surrounding her. The community that turned one woman's courage into a city's stand and a city's stand into a national movement. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted more than a year. It was exhausting, dangerous, and often discouraging. But every day, thousands of ordinary people made the same choice to walk instead of ride. Over time, that daily choice became a collective habit. And that, Duhigg says, is how movements are born, when the habits of individuals become the habits of a group, and the group finds purpose in something greater than themselves. So whether it's a church, a company, or a cause, the lesson of Chapter 8 is clear. If you want to change the world, don't start with power or persuasion. Start with people with relationships, routines, and belief, because that's where every great movement begins, in the small, invisible habits that bind us together. In Chapter 9, the final chapter of The Power of Habit, Charles Duhigg tackles one of the most profound questions raised by everything we've learned so far. If our habits shape so much of our behavior, often without conscious thought, then how much control do we really have? Are we truly responsible for what we do, or are we just victims of our own routines? To explore this question, Duhigg begins with two powerful and unsettling stories, one about a woman named Angie Bachman, and the other about a man named Brian Thomas. Both are ordinary people whose lives were shaped and nearly destroyed by habits they didn't fully understand. Angie Bachman was a stay-at-home mom who began visiting a local casino out of boredom. At first it was harmless fun, an hour here, a few dollars there. But soon, gambling became a daily habit. She didn't go for excitement or profit, she went because it filled a void. It became part of her. Routine, a cue when she felt lonely or anxious, a reward when she needed comfort. Over time, Angie lost control. She gambled away her savings, then her husband's retirement account, and eventually everything her family owned. When the casino discovered her spending habits, instead of cutting her off, they encouraged her, sending her coupons, free trips, and personal calls. She became what casinos call a whale, a high-value customer whose habits could be predicted and exploited. Eventually, Angie filed for bankruptcy. But her troubles didn't end there. The casino sued her for the money she owed. She argued in court that she wasn't responsible, that her gambling was compulsive, a product of addiction and habit. The case raised a haunting question: was Angie acting out of choice or compulsion? Duhigg contrasts her story with that of Brian Thomas, a British man who had a horrifying experience one night. He and his wife were on vacation when he woke up in the middle of the night, believing an intruder had broken into their camper. In his confusion, Brian fought the attacker, only to realize moments later that he had accidentally killed his wife. In court, doctors testified that Thomas suffered from a rare sleep disorder called REM, sleep behavior disorder. During episodes, his brain entered a kind of dream state. While his body remained active, he could act out his dreams without being conscious. The court ruled that Thomas was not guilty because he had no control over his actions. Both cases raise the same moral dilemma: if habits are automatic patterns triggered by cues and driven by rewards, when do we cross the line between responsibility and reflex? Duhigg explains that science has shown habits are stored in the basal ganglia, the part of the brain that governs routine behaviors. Once a habit is formed, it can operate without conscious awareness. We act almost on autopilot. But, and this is crucial, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for decision-making and self-control, still has the power to intervene. In other words, we may not always control how a habit starts, but we can choose whether to let it continue. Angie Bachman's lawyers argued that her brain was essentially hijacked, that the casino exploited her compulsive behavior just as drug dealers exploit addicts. But the judge disagreed. He ruled that Angie still bore responsibility because at some point she recognized the pattern, but chose not to stop. The distinction, Duhigg writes, lies in awareness and effort. Once we understand that a habit exists, once we can see the cue, the routine, and the reward, we have the power to change it. The responsibility begins the moment awareness begins. He contrasts Angie's situation with that of Alcoholics Anonymous, which helps people break destructive habits not by erasing them, but by replacing them. AA teaches members to recognize their cues, stress, loneliness, temptation, and substitute. Drinking with a healthier routine, like calling a sponsor or attending a meeting. What makes AA so effective, Duhigg says, is that it also introduces a new belief system, the belief that change is possible and that individuals are not alone. This belief gives people the strength to use their conscious willpower to reshape unconscious patterns. He writes, belief is the ingredient that makes a reworked habit loop sustain itself. Without belief in oneself, in community, in something greater, new habits rarely last. Duhigg returns to the question of free will. Our brains are wired for habits because they save energy. They allow us to function efficiently, to drive without thinking, to type without planning every keystroke. But that efficiency comes at a cost. Once a habit takes hold, it resists change. It's not evil or good, it's neutral. The meaning depends on how we use it. He gives the example of Tony Dungy, the NFL coach whose story appeared earlier in the book. Dungy trained his team to build automatic responses, habits that kicked in even under pressure. But those routines didn't make players robots. They made them prepared. The difference between success and failure was not the existence of habits, but the conscious design of them. That, Duhigg says, is where our freedom lies, not in preventing habits, but in choosing which ones to build and which ones to break. He explains that people who achieve lasting change, whether they're recovering addicts, successful athletes, or thriving organizations, all share one quality: they've learned to take responsibility for their habits. They don't deny them or blame them. They study them, understand them, and reshape them. Toward the end of the chapter, Duhigg reflects on what this means for society as a whole. If we accept that habits drive much of what we do, then systems, schools, companies, even governments have a moral responsibility too. Like individuals, institutions must be aware of the routines they create and reinforce. Whether it's a company that exploits addiction, a hospital that ignores dangerous traditions, or a community that tolerates injustice, the same rule applies. Awareness brings responsibility. Duhigg concludes by returning to the brain itself. Once a habit is formed, it never truly disappears. The neural pathways remain, waiting for the right cue to reactivate them. That's why relapses happen, why old patterns resurface under stress. But if we've built new routines, new cues, and new rewards, the brain can favor those instead. The key to freedom, he says, is to take control of the habit, loop to recognize it, reshape it, and take ownership of it. So are we responsible for our habits? Duhigg's answer is both compassionate and challenging. We are responsible once we know. We may not choose our first habit the way we learned to respond to stress or the routines we picked up as children, but we can always choose what comes next. Change begins with recognition, and belief gives it life. In the end, Duhigg reminds us that the power of habit is not just about control, it's about possibility. The same forces that drive addiction can drive recovery. The same loops that trap us can set us free. Once we understand how habits work, we can rebuild them, and in doing so, rebuild ourselves. That's the ultimate lesson of the book. Habits aren't destiny, they're choices disguised as patterns. And the moment we see the pattern, clearly we have the power to change it.